Hello, welcome everybody to our latest session. This is actually the last session of our series on the Labour Party and witch hunts throughout history of the Labour Party. But we are, we've remade this a little bit. We've republished this a little bit as a discussion group on a discussion roundtable on the way forward for the Labour left. We certainly, there aren't huge differences, I don't believe, between our three speakers. I think there's mainly nuances. I mean, I don't believe any of the three are of the opinion that we need to have a new party straight away. But I think there are perhaps differences in terms of the role of the Labour Party now and our role within the Labour Party. There's probably nuances around those issues and the best strategy forward. So initially we wanted to look back at our series. What can we learn from our struggles in the past on the Labour left? How does it inform the way forward? We're very happy to have three distinguished speakers with us tonight who all look a bit similar. Actually, no offense. Yeah, we could have done probably with more women, and perhaps somebody of a person of color would have been useful as well. But there we go. This is a reflection of where the left is. Unfortunately, but unfortunately and fortunately, things are where they are. So the first speaker tonight will be Kevin Bean, followed by Roger Silverman, and then Graham Bash. We've proposing that everybody has about 10-15 minutes to start for their initial suggestions or speeches, and then we can have comments and questions and contributions from the floor, and then the speakers can come back in any time, and we'll be summing up at about 7:30. So I'd ask comrades from the floor to be quite short in their contributions. So first, Kevin Bean, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Yes, I have to say that there's a noticeable shortage of hair amongst all three of us, which perhaps tells something about, yes, exactly, three bald men fighting over a comb. But quite seriously, I suppose all of us, although I'm actually the youngest one here, I want to just throw that in. But all of us, I suppose, have come through very sort of similar paths in terms of our experience in the Labour movement, or in the Labour Party over the last 40 or 50 years. And I'm very well aware of the histories of Roger and Graham. I would remember seeing them speak at meetings from really the 1970s, read the things that they've written and so on. What I'd like to do to begin with is to really, I suppose, put this in an historical context, partly because there's a lot of discussion at the moment about launching new parties, and also about the nature of the Labour Party itself, whether, for example, it has become a completely Blairite party, whether there's any future as a party for the British working class, and indeed whether we're in an unprecedented period. I think one of the problems that we often have is that we either think that history repeats itself, and therefore when we all made our talks in this series, we were all thinking of the parallels between today's events and events in the past. Or alternatively, we're always very keen to sort of talk about this being unprecedented. I certainly recall in the 1990s with Tony Blair that a lot of comrades argued that the Labour Party would have finished. It had become rather like the American Democrats, and so consequently was never going to be any sort of vehicle or area that socialists could struggle in, or indeed that it would just become yet another bourgeois party. When I began the education series of this round, I talked in particular about the origins of the party, and I talked about the various elements that come within it. And what I suppose I was very keen to stress was that, first of all, that there were many different elements in the party, that there were, for example, the ones which many people are familiar with, the Fabians, the trade unions, but also there was a Marxist component as well in the Social Democratic Federation, and I would argue to some extent in the ILP as well. The other point that I was trying to make about that period, really up until about 1918, was that the Labour Party wasn't an individual member party, and it did then constitute a united front, as it were, of the working class movement. So that it was actually a federation of groupings and parties. It was actually it was actually an area in which there was a degree of struggle for the direction. And this, of course, is very different from continental socialist parties who had in general originated from Marxists, from people who were committed to a Marxist program, and indeed, in many cases, had actually had to move from the political realm to the economic to actually establish trade unions, so that the relationship between trade unions and the socialist parties was a rather different one in continental Europe. Why I've sort of begun with this historical background is I think that we have to understand that the British Labour Party does have this historical trajectory, and many of the problems that the left have encountered, or indeed have been presented with, come out of the nature of this party, which is in one sense very much a working class party. It's still rooted in the trade unions. It still is the party that most working class people, a majority of working class people, who when they vote or when they participate in politics do so through the Labour Party. So it has that very dominant position. But the other element in it was, of course, the nature of its leadership, and indeed the leadership of the unions, who were increasingly, and I would say even from the very early days of the party, were being incorporated into capitalism. And we can argue about roughly when that occurs. I might suggest it for the unions, it occurs fairly early on. But for the Labour Party itself, it starts to very much form part of the bourgeois order of politics. So Lenin's description of Labour as a bourgeois workers' party, and in this he was maybe distinguishing it from the various continental socialist groupings. This argument was that although it rested upon a fairly solid organized working class base, that the politics of its leaders, not just their individual position, because remember in the early period, many of the leaders of the Labour Party had come from the working class. Many of them had, were, sociologically from that background, but politically they were working within the capitalist order. So their politics were bourgeois, and at the very best, they saw their politics as obtaining reforms and carrying out some modifications to capitalism. And indeed, I would say that this is the reformist nature of Labour, or indeed its bourgeois nature, is an issue that we have to really confront. Because of course, if we have an argument that Labour was a socialist party at some point in the past, and that, quote, we need to reclaim it, then I think we certainly sow a great many illusions in the nature of that party and the possibilities of what we can do with it. It's very clear, for example, that as a government party from the 1920s, that Labour isn't going to challenge the capitalist system. Even, I would argue, the Labour government of 1945 that carried out a program of social reform and public ownership, that was still essentially a capitalist government. It upheld the British Empire, its role in terms of the imperialist system, participation in wars, atomic weapons, and so on and so forth. So the history of the party is one, I think, of a fairly pro-capitalist leadership. The issue then for the left, and for the left in the party, is how we deal with that leadership, and perhaps more importantly, the nature of the party as a possible instrument. And I use the word instrument as opposed to an arena for struggle or an area where we can engage in developing socialist politics. The earliest left that I've referred to was, of course, in and around the Social Democratic Federation. It was around the Independent Labour Party. And that left was critical, but in the case of the SDF, it split from the Labour Party fairly early on. And although there were other left groupings, which, for example, became affiliated to the party, they were still in a very clear sense marginal, I think, until the emergence of the Communist Party in 1920. You'll remember that Lawrence Parker gave a talk about relations between the Labour left and the communists in the 20s and the 30s. But the clear point about the leadership was that from the time of the Russian Revolution, from the time of the First World War, it had demonstrated its loyalty to capitalism and its hostility to revolution. So there, I think I've explained the framework. The framework is. Now the problem that what we might think of as the official left in the party had, particularly in groups like the ILP, was that in many ways they were trapped within this political framework, and their political framework was in a sense battling to gain control of the Labour Party and to see it as an instrument for developing socialism, often the idea of socialism through parliament. So their politics were very much those of compromise, and I think very much the idea of a type of licensed or accepted place within the party. And again, the movements that I traced in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s to a certain extent all have that character. Now, of course, the other character that they have is that they do also reflect working class pressure, and they do reflect the aspirations of the working class. So Labour has this very contradictory pattern. It has many people who are starting to move towards the left in society will go through the Labour Party, will join the Labour Party. And this again is very true of the various movements that we've talked about. But my argument about their politics is that these are usually, both in economic and social terms, constrained by capitalism, and that even the best of the Labour left historically were very much committed to, I suppose, essentially reforms of that capitalist system. And even the most left-wing of manifestos still stayed within that framework. And in that sense, I think that the Labour Party acts both as a reflector of class struggle. It also is an indicator of the nature of socialist ideas. It's an indicator of working class pressure, but it also acts as a means of sort of corralling and controlling that. And so you have the paradox of it being both a place where people will look for some sort of socialist ideas, but these will then be, I think, quite safely contained. And I think one of the reasons why this is particularly important for our discussions on the future of that left, and perhaps more importantly, the experiences of the Corbyn movement, is really the sort of limits that we set ourselves and that the leaders of the left set themselves. So I'm not talking here about individual left wingers, I'm talking about the organized left groupings and the way that they invariably compromise with the right. It isn't just, again, that individuals decided that they were going to develop a career. I think it was the limitations of their politics, particularly those of mobilizing workers and the understanding of what both the struggle for socialism entailed and the unwillingness, I think, to break with the Labour right, that the emphasis on unity, the emphasis on maintaining the party and in a sense, always allowing themselves, and this again was, I think, a political strategy of always allowing themselves to be pulled and to be ratcheted towards the right in making compromises in that way. So my historical sessions were designed really to show that pattern. My talks, and indeed anything else that I've done, are by no means original. What I'm describing was identified at the time by various contemporaries who commented on this. But I suppose one of the standard histories that was influential from the 60s, the Ralph Miliband book, Parliamentary Socialism, captures that quite well when it talks about Labour's loyalty to the Constitution and the established order. And the difficulties have been that the Labour left has remained within those boundaries. They've remained within that constitutional order. And I think we can see that very clearly when we look at the experience of Corbynism. Like a lot of comrades, I came back into Labour Party activity after a number of years of being out of it. And, we can perhaps discuss this as the evening goes on. And in opening up, I've sort of set the historical scene. In some ways, the Corbyn movement was a movement of great potential. It represented really one of the most left-wing movements in my lifetime. It involved large numbers of people, and indeed it brought in old comrades who'd been away for a while, as well as new, younger comrades. So there was really quite a sense of enthusiasm about that. But there are many reasons why that movement failed. But I think politically, the failure of Corbyn and Corbynism wasn't just the strength of the right. The right you shall always have with you. Their pro-capitalism policy, their control of the party is always going to prevent us. The discussion we should have is on the failure and the nature of that left, and in particular the failure, I think, of the leadership of that left, but even really down into the middle ranks of it was a real failure to take on the right, to recognize that we would have to fight, in effect, a civil war in the party. And that's indeed what we got. But of course, it was a rather one-sided civil war in that the attack was launched on the Labour left, not the Labour left fighting in that other way. And I would argue that wasn't just down to the sort of personal limitations and weaknesses of particular comrades. It's not down to their careerism. It wasn't that they'd done deals with the right, although there's plenty of examples of that in my own case, where people who'd been formerly on the left now went over and worked with the right. I think it's this focus on maintaining the structures of the Labour Party, and in particular maintaining that de facto coalition with the right in order to preserve the party as a structure. In other words, to recognise that if we're serious about building a socialist movement in Britain, that's going to involve struggle, and it's going to involve struggle with the capitalist elements in our movement. But I've sketched out the history. I will talk as the evening goes on, and I will come in to talk a little more about the future. I thought I'd set the historical frame, partly to say that in some senses, we've been here before. The left currents that we've seen have many differences, from different periods, different issues, different nature of politics, changes in British society and so on. But they also have some similarities as well. And I think it's those, and to look at the weakness of those before we can in fact go on any further to map out any sort of future for that movement. Anyway, comrades, I've opened up while everybody else clears their throats. So I'll shut up now and let Roger and Graham come in.
Thank you, Kevin. I thought that was a very, very useful start, actually, and good as well, because you did indeed lead most of our education session, looking back on the history of the witch hunts, etc. So yes, and you need to look back and learn from your mistakes, don't you, in order to be able to move forward. So any new movement, workers' movement now needs to be, you know, if we haven't learned the lesson that there's a civil war going on, and the other side is using every weapon at its disposal to defeat us, you know, then we will make the same mistakes over and over again. So thank you for setting that scene. Roger, now, please. Thank you.
Right, thank you, comrades. Well, I don't intend to go much over the history of the Labour Party, because we're at the end of a long session, a long series of discussions where we've taken it in stages, and I think we've had a very thorough grounding in that. But I would like to say that perhaps the main difference that has come out between what I'm saying and what some of the other comrades are saying is that I don't think all the comrades recognise the qualitative change that took place in 1994 with the birth of New Labour. There has always been, of course, two Labour parties. There's always been the party which was created by the trade unions in order to represent the interests of the working class, and there was always the careerists and the parasites who infested the leading positions and the parliamentary positions and so on. But nevertheless, the Labour Party pre-1994 and post were very different entities. There were always cowards and traitors. It was always led by cowards and traitors. That was even embedded in the party anthem. Let cowards flinch and traitors sneer. We'll keep the red flag flying here. That was the call to the membership from the very inception, if you like, the birth of the party, and a warning for the rank and file to keep proper vigilance and control over the leadership. But what we had after 1994 is not cowards and traitors, but outright, blatant capitalist politicians. And it was a complete takeover. It was an alien class takeover, which took place in the particular historical conditions where the Tories were so discredited that they could no longer carry through the Thatcherite programme, and they implanted the cuckoo in the nest, if you like, with the Blairites to carry onward the Thatcherite programme. And the proof of that is not really from what I say or from what anybody, observers, would say. The proof of that is to look at what was actually the attitude of the capitalist class. Compare the capitalist attitude pre and post 1994. With previous Labour governments, the ruling class grudgingly tolerated them, and no more than that, and they displaced them as soon as they could. Even the Wilson governments of the 1960s and the 1970s, in both of those, there were serious plots by rogue elements, at least, on the rightward fringes of the security apparatus. They were still actually plotting military coups, and they exerted enormous pressure, and they got rid of every Labour government they could, usually before it had even served a full term. And the difference with from 1997 to 2005, which was the elections in which the ruling class absolutely clearly supported Blairism as against the discredited Tories, that was the real proof of the attitude of the ruling class. There were donations, business donations, just flooding into the Labour coffers. The Tory party was starved of funds for the first time in its history, first and last time, you could say. Rupert Murdoch, who won it for the Tories, he said it was the Sun what won it in the 1992 election. He won it for Blair in 1997 because there was a there was a quite open deal, if you like, made with Murdoch. Blair went to, I think, to Australia to visit him and so on, and they decided that the strategy of the ruling class was to support Blair. So what we're seeing now is the beginning of a split. There should have been a split 25 years ago. It didn't happen because, again, I mean, last week I discussed the whole history of the Blair period, and there were all kinds of factors which had demoralized the left, and they were just desperate and successive election defeats. I think 4 election defeats in a row. There was the crushing of the miners' strike, the collapse of industry, the eclipse of Stalinism in Eastern Europe. I mean, all of these factors together made for a kind of desperation among the Labour ranks that even let them drop clause 4. And clause 4 was very, very, very significant. And I completely disagree with those people who say that it was meaningless and irrelevant and it didn't matter and so on. It was absolutely crucial to the class identity. It was, and when Blair, the very first act of Blair, when he won the leadership of the party, was within months to call a special conference for one single purpose, which was to scrap clause 4. And why did he do that? Because it was a guarantee to the ruling class that we're not even going to pretend anymore to want a new society or to build something new. Up until that time, they always justified their betrayals by saying, well, we have to do it slowly and bit by bit and so on. And but they never in so many words explicitly abandoned the goal of creating a socialist society. So anyway, it's a split. This split is taking place now. It should have started, as I say, 25 years ago. It's happening now, and as always, it's being pursued with the uttermost ruthlessness by the right wing, and it's not being fought at all by the left, by the leadership of the left. So that leaves, of course, all of us in that dilemma. And we've discussed this many times at many, many successive meetings. And the two alternatives, do we stay and fight or do we start a new party? And what I've argued all along is that both of those, it's a false alternatives. Both of those are futile. To say stay and fight is meaningless because you can't stay and fight. You can stay or you can fight. What is happening now, that's the difference with the previous witch hunts. This is not a witch hunt that is taking place now. Witch hunts were always aimed and targeted at particular covens of witches. It was the Stalinists at one time. It was militant at another time, etc., etc. But this is completely different. This is a wholesale attack on the party itself. It's what Starmer and Evans are the war that they're waging now is to completely crush and destroy the Labour Party as an autonomous organisation, as a functioning organisation. All they want is supporters who pay their subs. Anybody who says anything politically, out. They're terminated. That's the word that's used now. Before, there used to be procedures to expel people. They had a hearing. They had, as I've said before, when the leaders of Millicent were expelled from the Labour Party, they each got five editorial board members. They each got 5 minutes to speak directly to the Labour Party conference in order to appeal. Now you don't get a hearing, you don't get an appeal. All you get is a terse email to say your membership has been terminated. It's gangsterism. This is the kind of tactics of Al Capone that is being waged now. So staying and fighting is out of the question. You can't stay and fight. Starting a new party, again, we've discussed it many times. There have been attempts again and again and again throughout the history of the Labour Party of left groups to try and build an alternative. And they were led sometimes by people who had huge charisma and mass influence. There was the Maxton and the ILPers in the 1930s. There was Scargill having led the miners' strike. There was, after all, the Socialist Party, which, or rather the Militant, which is now calling itself the Socialist Party, the Militant, which had led or played a leading part in mass struggles like the Liverpool struggle and the fight against the poll tax and so on. But with each of them, we saw that when they declared themselves a new party, instantly, almost overnight, their authority collapsed, and we see this the stage is littered with the corpses of people who tried to form alternative parties just by conjuring them up out of thin air, and you can't do it that way. What is happening is a split, and the way it's happening is, I think, what is very significant, in my opinion, is the development of the so-called shadow CLPs, or as we call it in my constituency, in my borough, Newham, socialist labour groups, Newham Socialist Labour. There are many names in different areas, many names, but the same instinctive compulsion to organise and to mobilise. I hope that in this discussion, I think that Carol is here from Newham Socialist Labour, and I hope she'll intervene and explain about the spectacular work that Newham is doing. Every day, Newham comrades are out on the streets, they're out on picket lines, they're out on pickets to prevent the eviction of people from their homes. They're organising campaigns in alliance with a number of ad hoc campaigning groups against the gentrification of the borough, against the privatisation, against the closure of everything that's left of any kind of autonomous community organisation. I won't give details. On Tuesday, we hosted a meeting for people from all over the country who were interested in following the example, just for an informal discussion. But the 35 people came, but what's significant is they came from 22 Labour parties, 22 constituencies. There is a thirst to develop and to fuse together and to organise and to exchange ideas. And so I hope that socialist labour groups or shadow CLPs or whatever we want to call them will develop all over the place. But we'll organise monthly meetings, exchange experiences, perhaps at a certain stage call a conference of socialist labour groups or shadow CLPs, and that is the beginning of a split. But one thing we always remember, and we were always being reminded, and absolutely correctly so, is without trade union base, it's still just froth. It won't actually develop a base. But what we're seeing in the unions is precisely that there is beginning now, again, very slowly, very ponderously. David Lowe used to represent the trade unions in his cartoons as a cart horse, and the cart horse is very slowly beginning to just stomp on the ground and begin to show a little bit of disturbance of what's going on. There's a gradual disengagement taking place. We've seen it with what's happening. I don't need to list them, but what's happening in the Bakers Union, what's happening in Unite, what had happened already in the RMT, what is happening in the CWU, what is probably going to happen once again in the FBU, what maybe is likely to happen with Unison, and no doubt others too. And that's the key. And there is that already beginning to take place. But the first one objection, which is always raised by comrades, is, but in Britain you can't form a new party because we have the two-party system. What about the first past the post system? How can we do it? You can't create a new party in that system, in that situation. Well, I'd answer that. It has happened already. Not only we saw it in a microcosm with, by the way, what happened in Scotland, where and before the development of the Scottish Parliament with its proportional representation system, but already the Scottish Nationalist Party, which had been regarded as just a kind of historical curiosity before, actually replaced the mass party in Scotland, the Labour Party. But never mind that, that's just a small example. What about the Labour Party itself? How did the Labour Party come into existence? They also faced a two-party system. the Tories and the Liberals were the two parties, and the Labour Party broke through that. How did that happen? Well, two things. First of all, socialist groups were formed in working class areas up and down the country in the form of the ILP. And at a certain point, the trade unions decided that they needed to break from the Liberals because they needed Labour representation of their own, and they formed the Labour Representation Committee. And the same process, all right, it's a very, very, very early stage. It's a very primitive stage, but or an embryo, if you like, but it is happening now, the same thing, that socialist groups are being formed. The fact that we're here now is a manifestation of that. The socialist labour groups, the shadow CLPs, the LLA, the new joint organisation, whatever it's going to call itself, and so on. They're all examples of socialists, and after all, there are thousands of people involved, of socialists who are getting together and hammering out ideas and trying to create the basis or the embryo of a new party. So that's the same process that is taking place now. What are the prospects? I'm just going to finish on this point. Let's look at the situation we're in now. After all, we don't have the luxury of meditation on this question. We have to organize, we have to mobilize now because of the you could almost say, well, perhaps literally say, the existential crisis that the working class is in and that society is in the present time, whether we take the question of the threat of the growing threat of more and more pandemics, whether we take the climate emergency, and whether we take just the general collapse of capitalism as any kind of dynamic force anymore. It's simply now degenerating into gangsterism and fraud and robbery. That's the basis of capitalism more and more now. So let's see what might happen now. Of course, the news from yesterday, it's quite clear that Boris Johnson is not going to last very long. There'll be a new and perhaps even more horrible right-wing Tory Prime Minister, but all the other alternatives to Boris Johnson are just grey blurs. I mean, I must say, I never found Boris Johnson charming or charismatic in any way at all. I don't think any of us did. But for some reason and somehow, he did manage to at least cut some kind of a dash, some kind of a figure, which attracted people to think maybe this is something different. What we've got now is the most seedy, corrupt, gangsterous, kleptocratic politicians that we've got there. And in a situation with soaring inflation, with probably more and more strikes, and I think very, very likely in the not too distant future, youth riots like we saw in 2011, and just a general turmoil and collapse of any kind of social stability. And in that situation, I always thought up until now, Starmer had no chance of ever becoming Prime Minister, but I don't completely rule that out now. There could be, in the situation of utter disgust and disillusion with the Tory government, there could be the election, I think probably not of a Labour government, but of a Labour-Lib Dem coalition, probably led by Starmer, or anyway, by somebody of the same type. And I think such a party or such a coalition might come to power, but only on a very, very low poll because of general disgust with both political parties and with the leaderships of both parties. So it would be something like we had in the USA before 2008, before the victory of Obama and then Trump, both of which galvanized things and the voting figures shot up again. But before that, the voting figures in presidential elections was, I think, not much more than 50% in election after election. And I think it might be that. But in that situation where you have a complete revulsion and disgust with both parties, I think then there could well be an impetus. There might be a development to the right as well, and a mass, not a mass, but at least a large ultra-right and maybe even fascist force, but also an impetus to the development of a mass left party. And that was, I don't say that again just because I'm speculating, but it's been shown already, because what happened when Jeremy Corbyn won the leadership of the Labour Party, hundreds of thousands of people surged to vote for him and to support him. And that shows that there is that base. By the way, in an opinion poll among young people, if you take young people, that's under 40s, that are in the, there was an opinion poll of what they thought of socialism, and there was 70% said they supported socialist policies, so they supported socialism. They may not have known quite what socialism was, but that shows that there is a huge thirst for radical left ideas. And I think in that situation, we might get the development of a mass left party with at least some of the trade unions affiliating to it. And I think that's the way forward. So there's a few ideas anyway put for the for discussion. I hope that's of some help.
It certainly was interesting, and like I suspected, you didn't stick to 10 minutes, as you said. Did about 20, but certainly, I mean, there's a lot of things I agree with you in your opening, and the electoral system in Britain is certainly playing a particular role in keeping the left divided, it has to be said, and facilitates splitting. I mean, I've just did a little written down which left parties there are currently are. Breakthrough Party, Resistance Party, the Workers' Party of Britain. Left Unity is still around, Socialist Workers' Party, Socialist Party, etc., etc. There's quite a lot of left parties around. I think in Germany, for example, where you have don't have the first past the post system, you have one big left party and everybody has to engage with it. That is a bit different here because of the electoral system and the first past the post system, and that is a problem, I think, and it breeds sectarianism on the left, unfortunately. But this is not nobody's come here to listen to me. It's about Graham Bash next. Thank you, comrade.
Well, comrades, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll start by saying that I do not intend to speak for as long as the other two comrades, and I apologise, but I've got a few medical issues. I've been stuck in hospital most of the day today, so I haven't been able to quite sketch out what I wanted to say. But let me just start personally. 53 years ago, almost to the day, I made the two most important political decisions of my life. One was to become a revolutionary, a Marxist, specifically a Trotskyist, and secondly was to join the Labour Party. And those decisions were taken at the same time. And until now, I've never doubted that both were correct, although there was always a fundamental tension. You see, I don't accept that what the left has traditionally done in the Labour Party is the right thing to do, which is basically, in today's situation, keep your head down, stay in the party at whatever cost, and beaver away. It's got some element of correctness, but ultimately we have to be visible. And the question, and I saw it in the chat, and quite wrongly, in fact, the comrade said, why are we talking about history? Let's talk about what we do now. Well, of course, as Kevin said, we can't really understand what we do now unless we understand our history. And Kevin's first point was very useful, but the Labour Party was born as a federation, the trade unions of the socialist societies and with no individual membership. It was a historical conquest for the working class, but deformed from its very outset. It was a class compromise which took the form of, as we know, of representing the interests, the economic interests of the working class, however, partially, only within the limits of what was acceptable to British capital, and of representing the working class politically only within the limits of the British Constitution and above all, the parliamentary system. Now that was the essence of Labourism, and it survived pretty much unscathed until there were these attempts to resolve those class contradictions. Firstly, in the 1970s, under the impact of events, where Bennism represented what I think actually was the most fundamental challenge to Labourism and class compromise. Still limited, but it represented a fundamental challenge. It did not succeed, and it led to its opposite, the counter-revolution of Blair, just as the movement of Corbyn led to the counter-revolution of Starmer. And let me firstly say, Kevin didn't say this, and it may be, therefore it's not his position, but there is probably a majority position on the Labour left that still regards what we do today as business as usual. And they're not recognising the fundamental change that is occurring. I don't go as far as Roger, by the way, and I'll come on to say why in a minute. But there is no doubt that whereas Blair did not destroy the trade union link, he did not destroy the party, Labour as a party of Labour, he didn't destroy it because he didn't have to. He was able to rule as New Labour without destroying it. And where I think Roger goes wrong on this is to say that this qualitative change happened in 1994 or whenever the new constitution was brought in, what was it, 1995 or whatever. It cannot be the case, because if it were the case, if Labour had at that point become a simply bourgeois party, you cannot explain how the phenomenon of Corbynism subsequent to that managed at least to make inroads into the party and actually win the leadership of the party, though it, of course, never won the structures of the party. So we're in this very, very difficult position. We're in the position where it is our, and Roger's right on this is a witch hunt, not just against the Trotskyists, the Stalinists, this, that, and the other. It's an attack on the membership. Because what they saw with Corbyn was this: the establishment faction of the Labour Party clearly understood that this must never happen again, and they're prepared to destroy the Labour Party if they have to, rather than ever have a left-wing leadership of the Labour Party ever threatening its interests. So, I mean, in that sense, that it's a fundamental change. And yet, the question then we face is, well, if, as Roger says, you can't fight in the Labour Party, then just someone here explain to me, how come even at this year's Labour Party conference, 3-4 months ago, we managed the radical policies, including public ownership on the Green New Deal. We managed to obtain the best ever resolution on Palestine with its designation of Israel, quite rightly, as an apartheid state, even something we didn't achieve 2 or 3 years ago. So the question we now face is this contradiction. It is likely that Starmer, it is possible and likely that Starmer may have to destroy the membership in order to make the party safe for capital, unlike Blair. But it hasn't yet finally happened. There is still scope for action. It is limited, and it's becoming more limited by the day. But what is the role then of socialists, of revolutionaries, or of Marxists? Now, I'm not interested in leaving the Labour Party. The only reason I'm not a member of the Labour Party is that after 52 years and 10 months, I was expelled. And that is the only reason I'm not in the Labour Party. And I would urge comrades who are still in the Labour Party not to leave. Is there anyone here who's suggesting they should leave? I don't think so, but if they are, they should say so. I don't think there's any basis for that. And I also don't think there's any basis in the foreseeable future for a new party of Labour being set up unless and until significant sections of the trade union movement lead that. It is one thing to say that Labour broke the two-party system 120 years ago. They did so because the trade unions, in their vast majority, supported that. At the moment, there is no indication at all. And I think it really is a bit over the top to suggest that somehow there's a huge significance. It's an indication of of the times, but it's not hugely significant that the bakers and the bakers alone have disaffiliated. It is not hugely significant that Law, Lien, Law, and all of these other groups are in their hundreds having these wonderful discussions. I mean, goodness sake, 15, 20 years ago, you had Scargill's party, you had the Socialist Alliance, and they amounted ultimately to very little. And I think it's certainly arguable to say that they counted for at least as much as the current groupings today. Now, this is not being pessimistic. What I'm saying is that Marxists, revolutionaries, always base themselves on class struggle. That is our ABC. That is where we start. And the question then, that was so right from the outset of in the beginning, is the class struggle. That's always been the case, and it is certainly the case now. And no doubt there is a change of emphasis because the lack of scope for action in the Labour Party, and I understand that. The question then is, how do we give political expression to the struggles in the streets? Struggles begin in the streets, in the trade unions and beyond. But if they stay in the streets, then they will fizzle and die. We have to build a political expression for the struggles of the working class. Now, I tire of saying, of quoting Gramsci, but I mean, Gramsci over 100 years ago said to us the obvious truth that the old world is dying, the new world is struggling to be born, now is the time of monsters. And that's the situation we're in. So look, I said I wasn't going to speak for long, and for once I'm sticking to what I've actually said, and perhaps I'll maybe able to come in more in discussion. I think there's a huge amount of agreement between the three speakers, and I imagine most people here. We base ourselves on class struggle. We regard the leadership of the Labour Party as the bourgeoisie within the workers' movement, in a sense that goes beyond what it was 120 years ago when the party was created. We are in the beginnings of a new situation. Starmer is going way beyond, or could go way beyond, what Blair did. Blair didn't have to finish the job. Starmer may have to. And we've got to work out a way through this. We're in a long, dark tunnel. And anyone who thinks there are easy answers to this, I think is living in cloud cuckoo land. It is extremely difficult to work out the relationship of party and class in a situation where 120 years of history is threatening to go up in smoke. So my words, I think, to the comrades is this: what way forward? Avoid this business as usual. It isn't. We are in the beginnings of a qualitatively different situation. I accept that, but it hasn't yet occurred. I don't accept for a moment that the qualitative change occurred in the 1990s. It didn't. Labour remained a bourgeois workers' party, or else Corbyn couldn't have actually assumed the leadership of it. But the beginnings of that qualitative change are happening before our eyes. And sometimes when new realities occur, we don't always see it in front of us. And that isn't an argument against any of the speakers, by the way, but it's against the common sense of the left, and especially the parliamentary left. And just one last thing, this statement that, you know, that Corbyn managed to get all these, you know, hundreds of thousands into the party, millions of votes. Yes, because it was a combination of Corbyn and the Labour Party. I mean, I don't believe for a word this nonsense about his Truth and Justice campaign, whatever it is, becoming a party. But if it did, it might win in Islington. I am certain it would not take off anywhere other than that. It was the combination of socialists and the Labour Party that created Corbyn. Take Corbyn out of the Labour Party and there'll be just one other left-wing socialist prophet without any power, without any base, unless we can build a movement of resistance, essentially from within the trade unions, building outwards. And that is a task of a generation. And I think that to underestimate the scale of it, if anyone is, and I'm not saying they are or they're not, but I think there's tendencies in that direction, is to mistake the period we're in and the huge, massive scale of the tasks ahead of us. And this is not a statement of pessimism. In order to change reality, we first have to understand what it is. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, Graham. Much appreciated. I think you're quite right to say, if anybody says they have the answer or know exactly what's going to happen in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, next year, they're talking rubbish. Basically, it's not quite how you said it, but I think that's definitely the situation. Everything is very fluid at the moment, so I think it's very important that we continue educating ourselves, discussing the way forward, and not dismiss comrades as being stupid or being having the wrong strategy, etc. They might well turn out to have the right strategy. So I think this is all very up in the air, everything. Comrades, we've already got 10, 12 people with their hands up. 3 minutes per contribution, please, because we have to come back to the main speakers by 7:30, and I will be strict and I take the time. So please focus on your main points, please, comrades. Okay, first one to indicate was Steve Freeman.
I'm muting myself. Thank you, Tina. I had a lot of things to say, but I've decided now, under your instruction, to cut it all out. But I want to agree with some things that 3 of the speakers said. First of all, I agree with Kevin about the importance of getting this story rooted in our history. It's just that I want to give a different history of the Labour Party. And I have been intervening with that aim in mind all the way through, not least in understanding Tony Benn's break with the Labour Party in the 1990s. But I'll come back to that other point. Secondly, I agree with Roger that there are 2 Labour parties, as he said, sort of coexisting together. One is, I call it the Loyalist Labour Party, and the other one, the Republican Labour Party. Now, that's all mixed up. It's not obvious like that. So what's happening is there's a split coming between the Loyalist and Republican parts of the Labour Party. And then I agree with Graham that this period that we're in, starting in 2008, is a different period altogether, post-2008 with the banking crisis. We're in a period where our political and constitutional and economic system is in a state of degeneration and deep crisis. So everything is going to be shaken around like a bloody earthquake taking place. And that's why we just can't look back and repeat what we did before. But I come to the same conclusion. The Republican Labour Party, which I'm saying has to come from within the Labour Party, it has to be fought out. So a new Labour Party is needed, right? A new Labour Party is needed. But we're having to drive out the Loyalists rather than the Loyalists driving us out. That's where it is. So we shouldn't be walking away from that. We should be fighting that in it. And I want to go back. I will finish on this point because I realised Tina, I don't have a chance to that. I want to go back to what I think was I want to go back to 1903. Okay, 1903. The left wing of the Social Democratic Federation organised around their Scottish committee, disaffiliated from the SLP. And in June, they had a conference in Edinburgh. Their 2 party names came forward. The first one was that it should be called the Socialist Labour Party. And the second one, that was after Daniel de Leon's party. And the second one was that it should be called the Republican Socialist Party. And that was put forward by Tom Bell, who was one of the founders later of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Now, we know who won that debate. Socialist Labour Party. It became the Socialist Labour Party that eventually went into one of the founding organisations, the Communist Party of Great Britain. But Connolly, and I know we don't have time to go into it, but Connolly himself, although he backed the idea of the Socialist Labour Party, he himself had in Ireland his Irish Socialist Republican Party and the so I'm about to go to the Declaration of the Irish Republic, the Russian Revolution, and goodness knows where else. But I won't do that now because Tina's waving at me. So there is a history story. I'll stop there. But I think I'll just finish on this point, Tina. In the 1990s, the split between Ben, who stayed in the Labour Party and proposed a Republican programme, and Arthur Scargill, who went outside and called itself the Socialist Labour Party, is repeating the same argument from 1903. And today we're going to have the same argument again. And this will be the third time we have this argument as to whether we're going in a Republican direction or whether we're trying to do this kind of, well, what we call the monarchist Socialist Labour Party that was formed in 1918 to 23, when the Labour Party passed Clause 4 and then voted by 3.8 million to 300,000 to support the monarchy. I'll stop there, too.
Thank you, Steve. Marian, please.
Well, the first point I want to make is that we have to look at the world as it is now. And with the pandemic, there is a crisis in every aspect of society, politically, economically, medically, environmentally. Everything is in flux. That's the reality. The reality as well is that we can't walk away from the battles as they unfold. Yes, there's a limited amount of things that you can do within the Labour Party, but we can't walk away from that battle. That battle is not totally lost. If we walk away, and a lot of the left did before, a lot of the left made the mistake before of moving out too quickly. I think we need a twin track strategy. We need to be operating within the Labour Party where we can, if we're still members. But you can't get away from the battle we need to have with our trade union misleaders. That has enabled Blair to get away with it and Starmer to get away with what they got away with. As I said last time, when I tried to get the CWU to go in to have John MacDonald as the candidate, I got nowhere in the broad left. I got nowhere to get the position that we should go in behind him in the Labour Party forum inside the CWU. Different story when it came to Corbyn, because there was a different period as well with stuff. But we have to fight where we can. And not only that, what most people are leaving out, we should be organising in our communities, in the trade union movement, in the streets and in our communities to change the balance of forces in our influence. Now I want to see a different Labour Party to what it is, but what I really want to see is a revolutionary party so that we can overthrow capitalism and imperialism and the monarchy in this country. That's what I really want, but we're not at that stage yet, and you can't jump stages. You have to be involved in the struggle, and you have to apply a transitional programme and a transitional method. How do you change the consciousness of people? I've seen movements among some of my family. They're sharing things now that I didn't think they would. Being opposed to Johnson and things like that. There's possibilities we can change the consciousness of people, and that is our task. I'm not pessimistic. I'm very optimistic. But if we keep taking the same shortcuts, we're burying our head in the sand, and you can't keep repeating the same mistakes. We have to learn. That's why this series is so important. So let's actually get together and make sure we actually change society for the better. And we have to engage in the struggle where it is, at the levels it's in, and trying to change the terrain in which we're operating.
Thank you very much, Marian. Quite right on the need to democratize the trade union movement. I'm just putting something in the chat next Thursday in this series. So if you're registered now, you can come along next Thursday. We will be discussing the need for a democratic trade union movement with Paul Holmes and Ian Hodson and others. And I'm very glad about what our trade union group has done, is they've produced a draft charter for democratic workers and trade union movement. And I've put the link into the chat, which I think is quite useful. And it starts with the members are sovereign. Officials should be elected at all levels and recallable. Everything needs to be transparent. Workers' representative on a worker's wage, etc. Unless some of these basic demands for democracy and control, etc., are involved in the trade union movement, we are running into great problems again, as Marion just pointed out. The next person to speak is Tony, please. 3 minutes.
Thank you, comrade. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think we all agree that in order to understand the present epoch, we actually have to understand the history of where we of how we got to this position. But the problem is, of course, that we don't agree on that history either, which leaves us with some problems. So I can only offer my own take of it. In my view, the Labour Party was never a bourgeois workers' party. It was always a bourgeois party, but it had a workers' wing. Today, it's in danger of losing even that. And I think we have to understand, if we're serious about history, that events and things change, and the Labour Party has clearly now historically changed. There has always been a battle between the left and the right in it. But I think we have to accept that today, after Corbynism, the right has won out. The right has got control of the machine, and it is politicised in a way that it has never been. And we also have to understand, of course, the Corbyn movement, because in many ways, Corbyn coming to power was an accident of history because of the morons who nominated him. It was a very diffuse movement. It was a movement really held together by someone who was, if you like, the symbol of that, Jeremy Corbyn. But in retrospect, it's clear he was a very hopeless leader. He wasn't capable of leading the fight against the right. And the Corbyn movement split. It split into a number of different tendencies, of which we are one. The question for us is, what can we salvage from the Corbyn movement and move forward? Now, people talk about the trade union movement as if it too has remained unchanged. But we've had a mass recomposition of the working class in the last 35 years. When was the last national strike? The really last major strike? It was the miners' strike. I mean, I can remember as a kid, strike after strike. The dockers were out, the shipyard workers were out, the miners were out, etc. That simply doesn't happen. The trade union movement itself is a shadow of where it was and what it was. And we have to recognise that reality. What we have had is the growth of mass social movements as the world itself is decaying all around us. We are in a political and actually, I think, a constitutional crisis as well today. What's happening to Johnson isn't simply an accident, just as what's happening to Prince Andrew isn't. We're seeing the decay of some bourgeois institutions. The question is how we take advantage of it. I mean, 2 years ago, actually 6 months after the COVID crisis began, we had the largest ever demonstration in my town, Brighton, over 20,000 people for Black Lives Matter. We've seen Extinction Rebellion coming up and many other movements. The question is how we harness that to the building of a socialist project.
Can you wind up now, comrade, please?
Yes, of course. If you can just give me a tiny
you what?
space.
Minutes, is it?
We are dead. We are dead in the Labour Party. Yes, we fight. We don't urge anyone to leave. But the Labour Party is a finished project. We have to accept the right has won. And the question is where we go from there. And I hope people come to the New Law Lean merged organisation, because I think that is, if you like, the seeds of a start. No more. Thank you.
Militant said that when they were checked out, Labour Party is dead. Matthew Jones next, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously we get 3 minutes to remake the world. Right, so, I mean, I think the thing is, okay, all you can do is speak in bullet points, as it were. And I think that there are key points here. One is obviously the First World War, in which the Second International, which the Labour Party was the worst part, betrayed the working class in the most gross fashion and itself collapsed. Obviously, then you have the Russian Revolution, the creation of the Comintern, and so on and so forth, and the rise of Stalinism. Stalinism actually acts to hold the Labour Party up and to hold up actually Stalinism holds up social democracy in general. The key point really here in terms of the evolution of the Labour Party is the collapse of Stalinism itself in 1992, and therefore, obviously, you get the shift of the Labour Party towards being a right-wing bourgeois formation, which is the process that's ongoing. Now, the problem being, of course, if you look at the Labour Party over a period, of course, is the left has always been subordinate. It's always been there, but it's always been subordinate to the right all the way through. The thing is, obviously, you get a situation, the basis of Corbynism, really, one of the conditions, obviously, in the Labour Party is in a state of near collapse. And actually, in Scotland here, where I live, it hasn't more or less collapsed. That there's then an opening created by accident by Ed Miliband, and you have an accidental leader, Corbyn, which then, of course, you then also have the situation in which the left itself has not created anything in the least bit with any credibility. And you have a mass of people who are looking for some means of fighting, austerity, and the attacks of the Tories and the ruling class, seeking to impose the costs of its own crisis. Which, I mean, the underlying basis of this, of course, is the gross crisis and continuing crisis of the capitalist system, which itself is in a period of decay. I mean, not just crisis, but actual decay. And the thing is that that opportunity opens up, and people pile into the Labour Party as a means of seeking that possibility. Now, obviously, in the conditions of extreme political confusion, as we see, no real forward perspective, a position in which the perspectives offered by the parliament, any element of the parliamentary Labour Party, including Corbyn, are completely inadequate, utterly inadequate. No question that. That movement is not, in my mind, is not one of loyalty to the Labour Party or the ideas of Labourism. It is actually seeking a method of say, fighting back against what's being done by the ruling class. And the thing is now, the problem, of course, with the decline and fall of the Labour Party itself, of course, the problem is the right wing don't have a social base. They can't control it. I mean, that's the one thing that Corbynism did expose also, is the lack of controls available to the ruling class in order to contain this movement and the potential.
Can you wind up now,
the working class. And so they needed to destroy it. They will destroy it. The problem is what comes out of it, as comrades have said. It's a question of creating a new movement, because the old one is gone. Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry, comrades. I know I'm rushing you along, etc., but we do have quite a lot of people with their hands up, and this is a big discussion. It's not the end of the discussion. We're not going to sort it tonight, so this debate will be ongoing, no question. Marie, please, next 3 minutes, if you can. Well, you'll have to.
I will. Yeah, I will. Normally do. Right. Well, I think it's a very important discussion. I think that something has not been developed very much, which is the crisis of capitalism and the absolutely incredible pace of it, in the sense that not only did they lose their colonies and their empire, but they cannot accept that they have done so. And so they keep going like mechanically in a manner which is going outside the reasoning and the conception of logical reasoning. They cannot reason. And so this is why in the Labour Party, the people who are allied or who are capitalists, they say that we cannot discuss this and that and the other, because they themselves cannot answer back. They do not have the answer. This is why they use oppression, repression, and expulsion in order to be right. But that is not going to give them the legs to stand on. And I think perhaps more should have been done, perhaps it was, on the crisis in the 70s, when there was the oil crisis and the crash. There was a crash of the stock exchange, there was massive unemployment, and then we had Callaghan, who started making people pay for it, which was the sign of where Labour was going, really. And then from there, the crisis has deepened, and it is not because they are strong that they are getting rid of the left. It's because they realize that the Corbyn movement was a force that could have been used by the mass of the population, particularly the working class and the unions, could have been used to go much beyond Corbyn himself. I think the capitalist class saw this and he sees this, that we are going to find another way. It won't be Corbyn, perhaps it'll be something else, but they are scared of us, and this is why. And so just to bring this to a conclusion, I think the comrades who think that we are in exile or that we have been thrown out, I don't think they're quite right, because it is the apparatus of the party, the structure of the party, and its aim of ameliorating capitalism. This is what has been, in fact, defeated. And they cannot cope with people like us who are making proposals. I agree with something Tony said just now. There's a constitutional crisis, amongst other things. And as such, we have to raise our sight ourselves to the constitutional things that we have to say. And this is not, there is no reason to present ourselves like supplicants who are sending a petition to the prime minister, for the prime minister to send it to the queen, to say that I'm just finishing, to say that we are against the honors to Tony Blair. Doing this, though I did sign, is an attitude of a supplicant, somebody who actually accepts the power of these people to do anything about it, where they are the author of it. And it's quite crass, and I believe that we can and should start changing our intellectual, ideological level towards a new constitution and a Republican one. Finished.
Thank you, Marie. Almost on time. I agree that petition is dreadful. I signed it as well, but it is a very bad attitude. Harry, next, please.
Yeah, comrades. I mean, the question is why have people left the Labour Party? Why have people not joined the Labour Party? And why has some people now written off the Labour Party as dead? And I think the mistake that many people have made is they've concentrated on the leadership and what they have done, come back to the Blair years right through, in fact, to the present day. And if you've seen what they've done and the apparatchiks inside the party, along with trade union bureaucrats and so on, they have continually to undermine the Labour Party democracy. But when you look at the Corbyn era, you have to remember is that people were leaving the Labour Party about 2 years into the Corbyn leadership. And it was nothing to do. The reason is that they were looking that the Labour Party had a very weak left in it. And Corbyn was doing them no favours at all. Remember, the purge against members began almost immediately that Corbyn became leader. And the emphasis was certainly in the trust that we put down behind momentum that was slowly eroded throughout the years. The key to people leaving, as well as being purged out of it, was the weakness of the left. It did not have an organised left in the party that people could have a say and influence party policy. That was under Corbyn as much as anyone else before and after. On the orientation of people towards the Labour Party, I mean, to be honest, I think there's a very good example in the trade union movement. And this is where I disagree with Roger, because it's not inevitable. Roger's mentioned the unions that have disaffiliated, one of them many years ago, one of them last September. But the fact is that the trade union movement, although Unite has cut funds and so on, the fact is that there is still an orientation towards the Labour Party within the unions. And that's a very significant development that has still been maintained. The key is going to be how the left builds inside the Labour Party. It's going to be down to what we do now, how we organise. And it's been mentioned, I think, particularly with Graham's contribution there. We have got to engage in the struggle of people. And that means discussing the perspectives that people are under today. There is an urgency to build a left. There's a strong ideas towards socialism, but we have got to engage in that struggle and build a new strong left that's orientated towards the Labour Party. Roger may be right eventually, but that perspective, Roger, is not definite. You cannot say that that is definitely going to happen. The key is building the left. If we fail to build the left, your perspective may come true. If we engage in building the left, an effective revolutionary left, engaging in the people and the orientation, I believe we can cut across that perspective, and I believe the orientation will remain within the Labour Party. It's what we do now is going to be the key. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Harry. I think you're quite spot on there. Strugglers inside and outside the Labour Party for now, but I think we must maintain an orientation towards the Labour Party, certainly as the Labour Left Alliance. I think we're kind of doing that without being, we're not saying stay in for, whatever happens at whatever cost, but political orientation towards the Labour Party is important when you're rebuilding the left on, and the program of that is important as well, that we're not building on the lowest common denominator, but with revolutionary politics. Paul, please.
I get what people have said about the chances of new parties, etc. I normally argue the same argument myself. I was in the Labour Party for over 20 years until about 3 months ago. And my letter was, of course, then you to suspend the secretary. People have said if Corbyn were to start a new party, many people have said that, we've had new startup parties before. That's true, but I'm not convinced that it will be destined to failure that the other ones have previously historically been. Because the fact is, and I know people don't like many Corbynistas, as it were, some of us refer to ourselves that way, is that he did bring many people into politics that were not involved in politics before. And there were thousands of them, and I don't think that can be brushed aside. The genie is out the bottle, in other words. I think what's needed is maybe a combination of a new party and also the shadow CLP that Roger talked about. I have a question specifically. I think Kevin might be the best person to answer. Is with regard to the Breakthrough Party, because my understanding is that many of those members that have joined were in fact part of the Labour Party under Corbyn. What interests me about that party is that it's essentially a youth party, and I believe all the leaders in the main structure of that party, I believe, is under 30. So what I'd like to know is, in Britain, have we had a party like that before, or is this in fact a new way of doing things? Yeah, thanks. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Paul. I don't think age is a problem. It comes with a lot of experience when you're a certain age. Neil, please.
Oh, right. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, super. I know I usually only spend 30 seconds to a minute, but I have written something down just prior to the meeting. I'll be very quick with it. The history is extremely important, and I'll just kick this through. It's just very interesting to listen to Roger, Silverman and other contributors last week. I usually only spend about a minute, as I said, but however, I just need a few minutes tonight, well, 2 minutes at the most probably, in order to clarify my reasoning and observations regarding the future of the Labour Party. I'm writing this now prior to it, as I've just explained to you, so I might miss a few things out. Hopefully I'll get most of my points across. First of all, I agree wholeheartedly with Roger's address to us last week. The problems that we face on the left are several. We have a corrupt system to battle against, mainstream media, newspapers, etc. I too remember the disgraceful news item where the army were using the face of Jeremy Corbyn as target practice. That was despicable, and yet it was brushed under the establishment carpet. Heads should have rolled, followed by an inquiry. Now, we are all aware of the Tory miscreants masquerading as Labour, i.e. West Street, English Kennel, Rachel Reeves, David Lammy Starmer, Yvette Cooper, Jonathan Ashworth, other half being the treacherous Emily Ogno and Baroness Chapman, etc., etc. Go on forever with them. I know this is a problem. I know some lovely people that perhaps politically slightly wet behind the ears that are speaking with some reverence and keenness regarding to people like Streeting, Reeves and Stephen Kinnock, and the saying things like they believe that we should all pull together. Well, obviously that's very difficult from what they did to us. So what do we do about that? Most of the general public are unaware that really nasty Tory-esque treacherous people are running the Parliamentary Labour Party, and they are waging war on honest, decent, true socialists in the party. This, as we all know, we've all been well aware, has always been the case, but this is now an even greater scale. Labour North is rotten to the core, as is most of Labour's administration. I spread this viewpoint every day, but remember, to get rid of the poisonous establishment within which we live, we don't only have the media to fight against, we have Her Majesty's Armed Forces and chronically servile, sycophantic, moronic masses to convince. How do we do it? Because from what I see, too many people are just not interested. Considering all the obstacles that we are unequivocally facing, how can we possibly work with the knaves that are in the parliamentary, i.e. Starmer, Evans, etc.? I need answers from people, because I'm not very optimistic. Thank you.
It's hard in these times. Thank you, Neil. Eric, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, all good.
Oh, fine. I happen to be one of the morons, one of the early speakers spoke about, because I joined the party in 1968 because it was a socialist party, and the socialist policies as laid out by the 1945 Labour government. Now, perhaps someone will tell me, but I don't ever remember voting those out of policy and new policies in to replace them. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
And so it's concerning. I keep asking, and I don't want to cause trouble with the party, but I keep asking Keir Starmer to confirm that he is a socialist, because my Labour Party membership tells me it's a socialist party still. So I keep asking him, is he a socialist? And I'd like to know. I mean, I can't get an answer if he and his leading colleagues are actually socialists, because surely if we're a socialist party, we need to be led by a socialist. Why he won't ask me, I don't know. I mean, the media keep pushing this life left and right. And you don't get that in the Tory party. What on earth is left and right in the Labour Party? I mean, you're either a socialist, believing in government-owned and run major service industries and NHS, not as at present private international companies owning all these and making a fortune out of it. I think if the Labour Party pushed that point, young people would suddenly realise, oh, I'd never realised that we the people could own the NHS, own the gas, water, electricity. We should be pushing that. And I'm just concerned as to why Labour are not doing that. We seem to have accepted, which worries me, the idea that, yeah, all these service industries that we fought so hard for and were brought into national ownership in 45 government are now privately owned, and profits are going all over the place abroad, and big companies don't seem to be concerned about that. So it worries me. Are we now a socialist party? I think what I hear, and people will tell me if I'm wrong, that most of the constituency parties are concerned because they feel they are socialist, but I feel the leadership is misleading us. I'm very, very worried about that. Thank you.
Thank you,
Hello.
comrade.
There we go.
Sorry, there you go. Chris, please. Chris Preston.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers. Interesting debate. My view is history teaches us that change is brought about by movements, not individual leaders, not political parties, or even NECs, although they are all constituent parts that have to be part of movements. I'm just reading 1929, Unite History, where the Labour Party disciplined members and disaffiliated numerous CLPs. The National TUC disaffiliated numerous trades councils, partly due to their left leaderships and their policies. In other words, comrades, we have been here before. In fact, we have been here many, many times before. As the left ascends, the capitalist class and the right wing moves. In the 50s and 60s, Africa mass colonial movements brought about change. CND, anti-war, peace movements, the Vietnam War, worldwide movements brought about change. The 60s, shop stewards, trade union movements. We brought down governments through movements. 1970s, 1980s, anti-Nazi League, anti-poll tax with the jailings. We created change. There was no Labour Party there. The Arab Spring movements through several countries. Again, there was no party or NEC with the Arabs. The Berlin Wall, solidarity in Poland, movements. Ireland civil rights movements, 60s and 70s. Again, these were mass movements that brought about change. 2008 to 2010, occupations, London, New York, in fact, 515 cities, anti-capitalist occupations throughout the world. To finish, Blair and Iraq, we know thousands left the Labour Party. Corbyn followed. Socialism is not led by paid parliamentarians, but by movements outside. Why did the Chartists call for annual parliaments? They understood where the danger lies with full-time parliamentarians, and the Chartists understood where and how change will occur. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. David, please.
Yes, thank you, Tina. It's good to follow Chris Preston because I agree with a lot of what he said, and my approach is similar. Just very briefly, I joined the Labour Party something around about 1975, largely influenced by Tony Blair. Left because of the Iraq War and rejoined because of Corbyn. But in the meantime, I didn't waste my political time, as it were, because I spent a lot of time involved with environmental movements and international movements. So my point is, there's been an awful lot of talk about new parties. Okay, I mean, I don't think the time has come, but it might come, of course, as has been said. Certainly the trade unions are obviously very important, and I certainly wouldn't minimize that. Yes, shadow CLP is another good idea, but I would say nobody's mentioned social media. No, you know, all this talk has been a lot of it's been about the past, and of course we can learn from history. But you know, thinking of the future, especially young people, which of course I'm not. You know, people support things like make votes matter, Global Justice Now, Stop the War CND. I mean, there's a whole list of organisations, if you like, or the formal organisations and informal organisations. What about the Black Lives Matter and the I was brought up in Bristol, by the way, and I'm proud to support the statue toppling. That wasn't from any formal Labour Party. I don't know whether any of the people that were involved were in any party. So I'm basically supporting what Chris says from a slightly different perspective, perhaps. Change has got to be brought about through movements. And I would say, instead of talking about the working class, instead of talking about Marxism or whatever, I think we should be engaging with the future. And we should be talking about concrete things like we must have electoral reform. We probably have to involve some sort of coalitions in the future. Certainly Green New Deals and so on. So that's my point. Let's not just think about the Labour Party or indeed other parties, but let's think about these other organisations, which actually a lot of young people particularly are probably more keen on following, because the idea of a a mass working class is, fortunately or unfortunately, has gone, as has been said already. Thank you very much.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, the last few speakers don't have a camera on, so I'm putting our main speakers back on screen. And it might be it's a possibility they didn't mean to put their hand up. George, did you want to speak? George, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Very briefly.
Go on.
My answer to Tony Greenstein is no, no, no. The trajectory that you are undertaking is with many flaws. So many people like yourself over the past years have taken that route and they have failed, utterly failed. That is number one. Graham, I am very grateful for you to have brought up Ben. Of course, he was a force to be recognized. I was around at that time in the 80s when he held the 4 Chesterfield conferences. And not only that, he dealt with workers' control. But more important of all, his bill of 1992 was a landmark bill where it touched 2 very important areas. Yes, Roger, there are 2 parties. But how we dealt with it in our North London constituency, which is one of the most right-wing parties in North London, was we carried on inside the structure of the party and outside the party. In the end, it was only us that was manning the stalls, going outside and talking to the people. And at that time, in 2017, they deliberately attempted to disrupt the election in more ways than one. Corbyn's failure was the fact that he didn't build local parties, tend to building his base in the local parties. He had a base, and it was mainly youth, and it was inexperienced youth who were outside the party. And yes, he did manage to set up or help set up momentum. The momentum, unfortunately, troubled its logical course and demolished itself. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. I suggest we're coming to an end now. It is 20 to 8. We want to be finished by 8 o'clock. I want to give the 3 speakers a little bit of time to reply to each other and to the discussion. I think it was quite a wide-ranging discussion. We had over 130 people in the meeting, which does indicate this is a really live and important debate. We're not going to bring it to an end today. This is beginning. We're still at the early stages of discussing where can we go and how should we organize, with who, on what program. I think these are huge questions which still need to be clarified. And at this stage, we're preparing, we're educating. I think the LLA is very keen to continue to educate comrades, and we've put it in the chat, and we're going to be running soon two education series. Citizen Marks is the other one, run by the Republican Labour Working Group on a Friday. We continue with our Thursday sessions. So this is a very important forum, I believe, to discuss ideas, discuss education, history, and where we're going. So I want to bring in the speakers in the same order that they spoke at the beginning. And the first one is Kevin, please, for about 5 minutes, if that's possible.
Yeah, sure. Okay, it was a wide-ranging discussion, and I'd just like to take a couple of themes out of it. And one is the idea of the struggles of the future, and indeed the whole idea of crisis. I think comrades agree that capitalism faces a crisis. It's been facing a crisis, I would argue, at least since the late 19th century, and the first imperialist war in 1914 was, perhaps the biggest reflection of that. So the idea of crisis has been with us for a very long time. Likewise, with the ideas of struggle, and in particular movements that are thrown up by that crisis. And one of the comrades said that history teaches us that change comes through movements, and he then argued that individual leaders and so forth had a role, but he talked about movements. Well, it's certainly true that movements arise. The Corbyn movement arose, CND arose, all the other movements that another comrade talked about. But there was the very important subjective element. Those movements don't arise spontaneously, they don't arise from nowhere. And in some of the movements that I was involved with, some of which the comrade referred to, that wasn't sort of accidental. There were people there who were organizing and developing ideas. And I think this is really the key question, because Marion made the point about consciousness, about awareness. And many of the issues that we're talking about here, the definitions of the Labour Party that Comrade Roger and Comrade Graham talked about, they're accurate to talk about the bourgeois nature of leadership, the pro-capitalist nature of leadership. It's quite accurate. But that sort of idea, those sorts of analyses are not widely understood. They're not widely understood enough in our movement. And so that idea of consciousness, particularly of raising political consciousness, particularly through particular programs and strategies and ideas, it's not, I think, just enough to have movements. Those movements will come and they will go. And many of the movements that the comrade referred to did very little to change the world. But when the world has been changed, it's been changed by conscious socialists, comrades who've developed programs, who've got clear strategy and understanding of the movement. So what I think we have to argue for now is for the development of politics in that way, around, my argument would be a very clear Marxist program, and it would be a program that attempts to raise the level of consciousness, that doesn't just talk about struggle, which will arise under capitalism, just doesn't talk about protest. It talks about creating a general political consciousness, but a consciousness that is subjective towards revolution. So this is, I think, really a very central issue. Another two issues that are related to that are, I suppose, the nature of the class struggle and the nature of the working class. A number of comrades have said that the working class in its whole form doesn't exist. One comrade said effectively that the working class is dead. Now, the working class is not dead. The forms of capitalist exploitation remain. There is still, I think, a proletariat in the sense that Marx described it. It takes different forms. It works in different industries, just as in the same way that in Marx's own day and in Engels' day and so on, capitalism was changing, throwing up new social forms. So to argue that we don't, that we have to have a very different orientation towards perhaps more amorphous social groups and so on, I think we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years, those sorts of politics, they've come and they've gone, and they've had very little impact. So I think that is a fundamental question. And of course, globally, the working class still exists in those economies which are growing and developing. There's still a proletariat, and there's still class struggles. There are still class struggles going on in Britain as well. But the point is, if we're going to develop a socialist movement and we're going to develop a movement that can really transform society, then we have to develop the politics and the program to do that. And I think the Labour Party still remains an area which we still have to have a strategic orientation to. I'm not arguing for business as usual, and I think that Graham is quite correct. Just to go through the old routines, just to assume that in the fullness of time we will get left-wing MPs and that somehow this will, develop a mass socialist left isn't the way that it's going to be done. So it isn't business as usual, but it's also learning that we have to have a very clear revolutionary approach. And I think that involves a strategic orientation towards Labour, but also the development of Marxist politics as well. So what I hope that I'm trying to do in my political activity, which I'm now outside the Labour Party, I've been expelled. And indeed, just this evening, one of the reasons why I was off is that there's a constituency meeting, my old constituency's meeting, and 2 more comrades have been expelled just before they went into the meeting. And there's been a little bit of a hoo-ha going on online, but that just shows you the way things are now proceeding in the party. So we need to keep a strategic orientation towards the Labour Party. It's a hard-won gain of the British working class. It is, I think, going to be an established factor. That doesn't mean to say that it can't go the way of Scotland. It can't go the way of some social democratic parties in Europe. Not arguing that, but at the moment, it is a game which we must hold on to and we must fight. We mustn't abandon it to the right wing, to the pro-capitalists. It still is an area that we can fight in, but we also can't ignore it because of the role that it plays in British society and British life. So, comrades, this is one of a series of debates. I'm sure there'll be debates tomorrow evening at the launch of the new group. There are a series of debates going on. Tony Greenstein and Jack Conrad are debating on Sunday evening. So we're continuing this discussion, but we have to keep our eyes on I suppose, the important question of raising the level of consciousness of the working class and developing politics that do that, not just relying upon spontaneous movements, sort of hope, a hope and, assume that it's going to happen. History hasn't shown that. History has shown that it's been through organized politics. It's been through organized revolutionary politics with a clear program and a clear strategy, not, I think, through just mere movementism. Anyway, I'll shut up now and let the other comrades come in.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I thought that was very interesting. Roger, please. Roger, you need to unmute yourself.
Right. Well, it may surprise comrades to hear me say that I'm going to be very brief because I'm not usually, I don't usually say that. The reason is because there are so many points came up and I really wanted to engage with every point, but I think it's better to just take a couple of points and to stick to them because there isn't time to develop my ideas. This is, as Tina said, it's not the end of the discussion. It's not the beginning of the discussion. It's a discussion which has been going on for years, but particularly for 2 years because of the situation we're facing now. But let me just put this in this way. It's not a theoretical discussion. It's not a question of philosophy. It's a question of practical solutions. What do we do in this situation? I want to take the example of Newham because both because it's the one I know best, but also because I think it's probably the clearest and sharpest example of what is happening on a national scale. When comrades say, "Oh, you have to stay in the Labour, you can't split. There's no hope outside it, etc., etc." I quite agree. I've said that, I've said that consistently for decades. I know very well that you can't just conjure up a new party out of nothing, and that's not what we are doing. What is happening now is a split, and it's not a split that we decided. We didn't decide to split. It's a split which has been inflicted by Starmer and Evans and the right wing. I mean that absolutely literally. And I said that I was going to take Newham as the example. In Newham, what they did last March is they shut us down. They didn't bother expelling people. It took them quite a long time to get round to expelling me, although eventually they did get round to it. Most of the comrades in Newham have not been expelled, but their parties were shut down. They didn't need to expel them because they completely destroyed the Labour Party. And that is what they want to do on a national scale. They want to destroy the Labour Party. They don't want any kind of functioning political party. That's why this is completely different from the purges of the past. It's not a purge, as I said. It's a systematic operation because on behalf of the ruling class, because the ruling class, as well as the bureaucracy in the Labour Party, were absolutely terrified when they saw the Corbyn, the way that the Corbyn movement developed. And they were absolutely determined they will never let that happen. How did Corbyn get there, by the way, was a question. He got there largely because of the arrogance, complacency and blunders of the right wing. Every leadership election, they gerrymander the rules. They change it. They rig the ballot every single time. There's not been 2 consecutive elections for the last 30 years, I think, where they've had the same voting system. Even in the 2 leadership elections between 2015 and 2016, they changed the rules. They did it in 2015 because they deluded themselves that they were not happy in the way that the trade union choice, that is the wrong Miliband, became elected as the leader, and they thought, right, because of their arrogance and delusional delusions, they thought that they were so popular among society outside of these little committee rooms of Labour Party activists. They said, we'll let everybody in. Pay £3 and anybody can vote. And they got the shock of their lives. They were horrified because that was the trigger which meant that there became a political eruption of all the discontent and all the radicalism and the thirst for revolution that was building up, particularly among the youth. And they, as a result, now they decided in no way are they going to allow that to happen again. In no way they're even going to allow any kind of element of democracy within the Labour Party itself. So what they did in Newham, they shut us down. And what do? We could have, we had 2 choices. We could give up politics. Well, 3 choices. We could give up politics, or we could join one of the myriad sects, or we could say, we are Labour, we are the socialist wing of the Labour Party, we are Socialist Labour. That's why we call ourselves Newham Socialist Labour. We didn't say we're breaking away from the Labour Party. We're saying, how dare you call yourselves the Labour Party? We're Labour. We represent Newham Socialist Labour, and that's what we are. And what we've done in Newham is what we need to do on a national scale. And as I say, I wish that Carol had participated in the discussion, because she could give a lot better than I could. She could list the dozens of campaigns that the Newham Socialists are conducting, Newham Socialist Labour are conducting on the streets day after day. Literally in the last, well, today they were on 2 different picket lines and demonstrations. Yesterday they were on 2 different ones, and so on, and street stalls and so on. And we're going to put up candidates in the council elections too. Why shouldn't we? Because we are the real flesh and blood. We are the real life of the Labour Party. The only other Labour Party there is a bunch of corrupt councillors and bureaucrats. So that's what we're doing now. Well, I think that is the way forward, and that is on a local scale, and if you like, on a minimal, very embryonic stage and so on. But that's the shape of things to come. That's how a new mass workers' party is going to be created. It'll be the socialist wing of the Labour Party spitting out, if you like, elbowing aside the bureaucracy who are actually interlopers and pirates, if you like, who've boarded the Labour ship. We have to see it in that way. We're not saying break from the Labour Party. We're saying we are the socialist wing. We are the real heart and soul of the Labour traditions in Britain, and we're building on that basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Graham, please.
Very quickly, Tina, you started off by suggesting that really there was much more that united us than divided us. And I think that is actually true. We're talking here about very difficult, nuanced ways forward, and it isn't easy. Now, what we're seeing in this counter-revolution in front of our eyes is class war. And counter-revolution, as we know from history, is the price the working class, the left, pays for failing to take power. We saw it in the last century, in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, in Chile, in tragic, extremely tragic circumstances. And we're seeing a form of that at a lower level in the Labour Party today. This is class war, and this is counter-revolution. And the point that I need to underline, if we are to learn these lessons, is that if Ben and Corbyn, in their different ways, represented a challenge to that old Labourist compromise, it had revolutionary implications. But the problem was that neither of them were revolutionaries. And this concept of trying to build a revolutionary leadership that is rooted in class struggle, rooted in the organizations of the working class, is a constant theme for us all. And we cannot avoid either wing of that, if you like, tension, which I referred to in my opening, which is the need for revolutionary politics and the need to be where the working class is, with the working class, but at its head, as Marx explained. We do not form organizations separate and apart from those of the proletariat, said Karl Marx. And that is a useful beginning point for us. Now, there are a number of dilemmas we face. One, the crisis of representation, of course, the reducing scope. Whatever we achieved at last year's conference, and don't underestimate it, the reducing scope for activity, even membership of the Labour Party, against the reality that there is little possibility in the immediate future of creating a new electoral alternative. We can create movements, we can create socialist organizations, but we're talking about governmental power. And that is going to be extremely difficult in the immediate future. Secondly, this idea, we've been here before, against the fact that, of course, we're in unprecedented times, and we can work out general themes of history, like the old Bolsheviks did at the beginning of the 20th century in Russia. They had these general march of history, but often they failed to look at the specific characteristics of the period we're in. And the characteristic of this period is this extreme crisis of representation, where Labour is being effectively, increasingly removed, not completed, as an organ of struggle. And thirdly, a point that I always used to make, that our role, I used to say, is that we are laying down a tradition, I hope, for future generations. But that's not sufficient either. Because, of course, with the extremity of the climate crisis, we don't have all that much time. And the question, therefore, of revolutionary politics has become what it was at the start of the First World War in the last century. It is a question of life and death. It is a question of socialism or barbarism. Now, I saw in the chat quite a serious criticism of my opening, and I do take it seriously. It says that it said that I was being pessimistic and I underestimated the possibility of transformative change. If that is so, that is a very serious criticism, and I hope it isn't, because what I think we have to do, as I said right from the outset, is base ourselves on class struggle and try to break through ways of finding a political expression. And it's no good just saying it's there, you know, we'll resist. Of course we've got to resist. That is where we start. But we have to give it a political, a governmental expression, and we are not yet in a position to do so. And I suppose I cheer myself up when I'm feeling a bit pessimistic, which I do sometimes, to remember that in January 1917, Lenin wrote to the Swiss workers that there was no possibility of revolution in his lifetime, a couple of weeks before the February Revolution broke out. Now, that is maybe just words of comfort, but ultimately we are in extreme global crisis with the possibility, well, there are immense struggles taking place throughout the globe. And of course, there's a danger of having an English centrism or a UK centrism that necessarily sees what is happening here as central. Well, perhaps it isn't. Perhaps we have to base ourselves also on that global struggle that has revolutionary possibilities, just as at the beginning of the last century. And it's on that basis that we have to continue. However difficult it is, there is simply no alternative but to do the twin things, which certainly have been the attempted foundation of my life, although clearly inadequate and clearly failing, which is to try to develop revolutionary politics and to try to be where the movement is. Because it's not much point in being in the movement without being a revolutionary, because you're actually succumbing to existing realities. But there's little point in being a revolutionary if you're outside the movement, because there's no one there to listen to you. So comrades, keep fighting, base ourselves on class struggle and revolutionary politics, and let's hope that this is the beginnings of a resurgence. And whether it is or it isn't, partly depends on us, but let's not be megalomaniacs. It depends on the realities, the class struggle outside of this discussion in Britain and throughout the world. Thank you, comrades.
Very good, Graham. Thank you all, comrades, for participating in this important debate. As we said at the beginning, you know, we're not going to solve it here today, but I think what we're doing is actually part of the solution. I.e., we're discussing things out. We're openly discussing what went wrong, what we think we need to do better next time we have the chance to get anywhere near the levers of power, and how we are actually talking to each other without, you know, no platforming views or without saying, you know, you're just totally beyond the pale, etc. Because we're not. I think there's different views in the working class, dozens, if not more, thousands, and we need to be able to discuss these things in a comradely way. And this is, I think, the strength of the LLA, and that's something we want to continue. And as Graham said, we're living in very fluid times. Capitalism is in deep crisis. It is a system in decline, and almost anything can happen very, very quickly if we're prepared, if the working class makes a move. But there needs to be an organized intervention and an idea of what revolutionary politics are. And this is part, I think, of the role we can play in the here and now. So next week, as I said, we want to discuss the need for a democratic trade union movement. Next Thursday, 6 o'clock, with Paul Holmes and Ian Hodson and others from the LLA Trade Union Group. And I believe trade unions are an absolute crucial part in remaking the left and fighting back. And this would be an interesting discussion. There is a draft charter on our website. Comrades, please have a look at it, Trade Union Charter and Workers' Charter. But yes, I enjoyed tonight very much. I hope other comrades did as well, and the speakers and in the audience. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night. Bye-bye.